I'm Thomas Bowman.
I'm Lauren Burke.
And this is Pod Virginia, a podcast that's not being investigated by the January 6th committee. Michael's on vacation this week, so we've got Lauren Burke of the Burkefile Podcast filling in. Lauren, thanks for coming back.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me back.
We really appreciate it. Later, you'll hear our conversation with the House Republican Caucus Chair, Delegate Amanda Batten. She has a bill that was among 7 signed by the governor on Wednesday that had to do with human trafficking.
Delegate Batten's bill provided in-state tuition to students who were brought into Virginia as a victim of human trafficking.
But before we get to that, we're covering 3 main stories today.
Our first story, the redistricting case, has a new litigant, Jeff Thomas, author of The Virginia Way. The court ruled that Paul Goldman didn't have standing, and so Thomas filed a new lawsuit seeking new elections this year.
For our second story, the defensive coordinator for the Washington Commanders called the violent insurrection on January 6th a, quote, dust-up. Well, that caused a dust-up between the Washington Commanders and the General Assembly, which decided to scrap a bill to bring the football team to Virginia.
For our third story, Virginia Governor Youngkin is forcing all state employees to work in the office instead of at home. Dems say this hurts the state's competitiveness with the private sector.
Okay, let's get into it.
So, Thomas, let's talk about the Paul Goldman case. You know, the crux of this case, the underlying law, of course, was the fact that the districts are effectively the wrong districts because the districts were not properly drawn because there was a delay, COVID, et cetera, and so on. And Paul Goldman sues last year. This judge, David Novak, throws the case out because Paul Goldman doesn't have standing. Goldman today, Friday, June 10, is going to refile, file an appeal. I think for the most part, people agree that the underlying law, he's actually right, but he doesn't have standing. But interestingly enough, we have a new character in this story, an academic, an author named Jeff Thomas. That is an exciting new thing for this case because Jeff Thomas does have standing.
And his lawsuit is a little bit different. Goldman's was dismissed on technical grounds, but Jeff Thomas says that his Richmond area district is overpopulated, potentially giving him a stronger claim that his vote is illegally diluted by the state's failure to complete redistricting on time.
Apparently, there's a hearing Monday, so it sounds like the judge is going to be moving fairly quickly. Part of what was going on with the Goldman situation is that we were waiting around week after week, waiting for this decision for Judge Novak, just on the standing question, which of course is a technicality effectively. But with now the new litigant involved, with Jeff Thomas involved, it sounds almost like this could actually happen, or at least obviously there would be a ruling on the merits of the case.
Well, they're running out of time, Lauren. So if it's not in the budget, which goes into effect July 1, it's actually going to be physically impossible for the State Department of Elections to hold new elections and to prepare for it, to do the primary and hold those new elections across the entire state in time for November, whatever election day is in November. So I'm not convinced that it will lead to a different result, but what could happen is what happened a few years ago when the courts ruled that several districts in parts of Virginia were illegally racially packed. And so where he is coming in at just this Richmond district being illegally packed, I think if any changes happen, it would be changes to the boundaries in a very limited set of districts. But technically speaking, I don't know how the state would manage to pull off an election that it doesn't have the funding for. And, it's only got less than a month to figure it out.
No, that's a really good point. I mean, the whole thing really is about timing and whether or not there is enough time and, of course, money. And frankly, there probably isn't. So, and of course, as I think everybody realizes, those members of the House of Delegates on both sides of the aisle are not burning, they're not interested really in running what would end up being 3 years in a row. So there's not a lot of political excitement for doing this, to say the least. But you're right, the clock is ticking and time is running out.
Yeah, and while the activists say, well, forget what the elected officials want to do, this is about the people, this is about effective representation, I hear you. But also think about financing these elections, right? So if you're somebody who feels that way, you're more my guess is you're probably more likely to vote Democrat in the first place. So if that's what you want, think about who has an easier time funding their reelection campaigns. 3 years in a row is a lot of money for the Democratic donor class.
The only thing that I think about from a political standpoint is, of course, the Democrats lost the House of Delegates last November, of course, along with all the statewide offices. So one would think that they would be more enthusiastic about the idea of having elections again because it gives them the opportunity to control the Senate and the House.
I think all of that really would depend on the attitude federally. A lot of Democrats credit their party's loss in a Republican clean sweep to federal politics and attitudes toward Biden again on the federal level generally. So if nothing has shifted as far as those political dynamics go, then there's no guarantee that running a campaign in 2022 is going to be better.
Very good point.
Well, and the 21 race broke the narrative that more people voting helps Democrats. It didn't. It actually helped Glenn Youngkin.
Right. No, that's right. That's absolutely right. And we're sitting here with $5 gas in Richmond. It's pretty, with the economy being what it is, I totally can see the political argument as the stock market drops as we speak, that maybe things would get worse for the Democrats in the Virginia House of Delegates if you're on the same ballot with the members of Congress, because your point is very well taken. We had that record turnout, uh, you know, 7 months ago, and the Republican won and won big.
I guess the takeaway here is be careful what you wish for. But Lauren, let's move on to our next story. So, the defensive coordinator for the Washington Commanders got in some hot water. He had to issue a non apology in which, after calling January 6th a dust up, his non apology note compared it to other peaceful protests. Of course, there was nothing peaceful about a violent insurrection. So, Lauren, help us understand, what did the General Assembly do? And what were they considering doing? And what's the status now?
Well, the status is now that the stadium is really off the table right now. I mean, and in part because, frankly, the ownership of the team, Dan Snyder. I mean, Dan Snyder being the owner, I think, was the first thing that is a sticking point. He is under an investigation that made, I think, people very uncomfortable right at the onset. Then you have the money. Then you have stadium deals writ large around this country that always seem to be a burden on the local taxpayers. I mean, that all has to be figured out. And then on top of everything else, the defensive coordinator of the Washington Commanders, Jack Del Rio, makes this political statement in the same week that all of this is on everybody's mind. And that was really bad timing. That was
You know,
tremendously bad timing,
and
because
right before the new videos dropped and
I
the January 6th hearing, public
that's right.
hearing
That's
dropped.
right. That's right. Those videos dropped 2 days after Jack Del Rio says, "Well, this was a dust up at the U.S. Capitol." And of course, there wasn't just a dust up; it was an actual threat to our democracy, as we all know. And we certainly have seen other coaches on other teams, as Steve Kerr and Popovich and other people in sports make political statements. But this one in particular for Virginia was very, very poorly timed because I do think that there can be a lot of economic excitement around the stadium, perhaps coming into Virginia, but that coupled with Dan Snyder being the team owner is a bad combination. And politicians in Virginia were not particularly enthusiastic to begin with, and then you add sort of this right wing MAGA political statement to it, and that really knocked it off the table. So I where it stands now is that it's off the table. That's what's going on.
Yeah, I can't imagine how saying something like this that causes the team to lose out on a stadium site isn't a violation of your contract terms.
You know what? I didn't even think about that. There's probably some clause in there about, usually in a lot of contracts, it will say something in there about, not embarrassing the team, et cetera, and so on.
Yeah.
But I suspect there's nothing specific about political statements, but you never know.
Well, I have a sneaky suspicion that Dan Snyder, notorious micromanager, is already looking to replace him. But of course, if you look at what Senator Dick Saslaw said when he decided to pull the bill, some people interpreted it as him just waiting a little while until the heat cools.
You know what? That could be true. Certainly, it's hard to tell. Nothing is ever completely dead in politics. We know that the media cycles and attention spans being what they are, of course, it could be resurrected. Certainly, one could argue that it could be an economic boon for any area that that stadium ends up in. It's just that putting extra hurdles in front of the discussion that are political certainly makes it. When you pack that onto the fact that taxpayers may have to pay something for this all to happen, which is typically the case with these stadium deals, it doesn't make it easier. But you're right. I mean, of course it could come up again.
All right, Lauren, what else have you got for us?
Thomas, our third topic is that Governor Youngkin wants employees to not work remotely, and he missed a critical deadline with regard to this issue. The issue really is the fact that after COVID, after everything that happened economically with COVID, and so many businesses, of course, struggled and/or shut down, the governor wants people to be working at work to, of course, bring back the economy in the downtown area. And that has its complications for childcare and for so many other issues, as we learned over the last 2 years. This is something that certainly a lot of activists are pushing back against, and certainly with regard to the issue of childcare alone, and a lot of other issues that people have having to come into work every single day. And quite frankly, Thomas, I think a lot of people learn that if you have a computer related job, you really actually can do that any place. This
Yeah.
idea of coming into work and being physically in and going through traffic and all that, I think it made people rethink a lot of that. But of course, a lot of elected officials want people physically back in.
Yeah, and cities and towns and municipalities, of course, the businesses that serve those areas could use more traffic, and so there's some amount of economic argument to be made. But the bigger problem I see is that, yeah, it does certainly make the state less competitive with the private sector, who's figured this stuff out. In my consulting for private sector clients, one of the things we realized on the question of remote work versus in person work is the only people who really, really want in person work are the mid-level managers, because they don't know how to do their jobs if they can't go and see you in person. So what does that mean? That means that you need to hire managers who are qualified to manage remotely.
Exactly right. And having the government workforce in, of course, brings a lot of people, obviously into the downtown sector, and is going to impact businesses. I know in New York it was like the mayor tried to get, like, really sort of mandate that everybody, comes in. It's a touchy thing because most government jobs, and as somebody who's worked in not only in media but in state and federal government, you're at the computer all the time. You're at the computer probably
Mhm.
80% of the time. so
Or
so this
staring at your
argument,
phone for the other 20%.
yeah, exactly right. Exactly. You're staring. That's right. When you're not at the computer, you're staring at the phone. Now that could happen any place. You don't have to really be sitting in a cubicle for that. And it's actually sort of an old-fashioned notion that you want to physically see someone sitting there. But again, what we learned during COVID was that none of that was necessary. A lot of these buildings in the downtowns of bigger cities have found that out. And so we are now, I think, in the process of reimagining, whether or not people really have to be physically sitting in a specific place to get work done.
Yeah, I think that's gonna wind up being a old-fashioned 20th century notion. And the other concern that I have about this policy, or lack thereof, a remote work policy, Lauren, is, well, I guess there's two. One, it's retrograde, because governments have been enabling remote working, like, for a long time. It's part of what has made government jobs such a good job. But the other problem with this is, by forcing everybody to come in or making it almost impossible, is it's a wholesale violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. You can't force people into situations that would hurt them because you as the government feel like it, right? That's arbitrary and capricious.
Right. That's right. And some I've seen like on the federal level, they're sort of playing around with the idea of having people come in, 2 days a week, 3 days a week. It's almost like the feeling of, we want to see you and know that you're in the general area of where you are, where you live near work. And as far as disabilities are concerned, sure, your point is extremely well taken on that. I don't even know that the governor has really thought about any of that consideration. It would appear that that's not the case. But really, I think everybody generally understands that what this is really about is to try to get the local economies thriving again after the hard hit that they took for the last 2 years.
Yeah, well, there's definitely going to be a big fight on it and messaging. And I think Democrats ultimately are right. It's going to be harder for the state, who already has lower salaries, to recruit people to come take state jobs that, like, I don't know about you, but I'm not interested in working in person anytime for this foreseeable future. I sure miss having colleagues, I suppose, but in the social interactions. But I mean, come on, we're not there to make friends. We're there to earn a paycheck.
I have to admit, I've become bored of, COVID at the beginning. Yeah, it was sort of cool and fun in the first 6 months. And then I got sort of bored with being, in the same place. I kind of don't mind going to certain locations. The thing of it is that, some people do have health considerations that are not minor. So with regard to COVID, even though, yes, it's not as bad as it was at the very beginning, in 2020, a lot of people are fine with being at home. But it's funny. I have several friends who are chiefs of staff and staff directors, people who do a lot of hiring, and they're saying in the interviews with people, the first thing that people ask about is whether or not they can work remotely. They're not even asking about salary first. It's asking about, can I work remotely? So this is definitely something that's going to be a huge issue with regard to employment issues moving forward.
Yeah, I agree. More to come. When we come back, we're joined by the Virginia House of Delegates Republican Caucus Chair, Amanda Batten. We're going to talk about her bill to help victims of human trafficking get in-state tuition at Virginia colleges, as well as what comes next. We'll be right back.
This is Delegate Danica Rome of the 13th District, and you're listening to Pod Virginia with Michael Pope and Thomas Bowman.
We're back on Pod Virginia. I'm Thomas Bowman. We're going to talk about a crime that happens in the shadows, and it doesn't get a lot of press. But the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services calls it the second largest criminal industry in the world today, and the fastest growing. That's human trafficking. Virginia is about to get a new law to help victims of human trafficking, and it was introduced by our next guest, Republican Delegate Amanda Batten of James City County. Thanks for joining us, Delegate.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on. So your bill, which is about to become a law, allows victims of human trafficking to receive in-state tuition. Why did you introduce this bill, and what do you hope it'll accomplish?
Well, I've actually carried this bill 3 years. So I carried it my first, second, and my third legislative session. And the reason that I'm so passionate about this particular issue is because it is local to my district. We have an organization that is here in the greater Williamsburg area called Letitia's House. And they are a nonprofit, faith-based organization, and they deal with women who are victims of human trafficking. And I've had the opportunity over the years to watch the organization from the very beginning. I found their mission, very interesting, of course. But to your point of this being something that often occurs in the shadows, I appreciated the fact that it just raised awareness in not only the Williamsburg community, but the greater Hampton Roads area of, the problem with human trafficking and how prevalent it's become. And one thing I learned as I was kind of discussing the issue with, the folks who are affiliated with this organization is that a lot of these women, they're not here permanently. They're here maybe temporarily. This is a safe haven for them. They might be a resident of another state, but it's better for them to be up here in this safe house here at Letitia's House, receiving services here, even though maybe they're a resident of, North Carolina, South Carolina, wherever it might be. Now, of course, if you live in Virginia long enough, you basically establish residency. I think after 6 months for intent of you can have access to in-state tuition. But a lot of these women aren't here necessarily all that long, or they just have a lot of mitigating circumstances that prevent them from meeting that residency requirement that would be pretty easy for the rest of us to come by. And what the organization does, Letitia's House here, is they pay that tuition for the women. So what it does is it really limits their ability to spend those funds in other ways. So they approached me with this idea about in-state tuition and said, we're not asking for free tuition. We just want these women to be eligible for in-state tuition because that would save us a lot of money when these women are applying to college and actually are accepted into programs. So that's why I decided to carry it. It's if you look at the bill, it's actually kind of interesting. You'd think maybe that there would be a large, fiscal impact statement that's attached to this, which is, of course, the price tag to the Commonwealth. But there's really not. Sadly, there's not a lot of women who are even eligible to go to college. There are so many of these ladies who never even had the opportunity to finish high school. So it's a pretty small population of women, but it's extremely meaningful to the organizations that support them and, of course, to the ladies themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense, I suppose. There can't be that many people who are in a situation like that wind up in a position to go to college. But those that do, if they're working with an organization like Letitia's House, could absolutely use some help from the state, at least in-state tuition through that organization. And so help us define our term here. So what is human trafficking? Because I think people have an idea of what it might be, but it's one of those terms that kind of gets thrown around a lot. So how does your bill define human trafficking?
What the language says is that a person may be a victim of human trafficking regardless of whether or not they've been charged with or convicted of any offense. So eligibility may be proved by a certification of such status as a victim of human trafficking by a federal, state, or local agency or a not-for-profit agency, one of whose primary missions is to provide services to victims of human trafficking. So basically, law enforcement agencies or certain nonprofits are able to certify that these individuals are victims of sex trafficking. And again, every situation is unique. So I don't know that there is a boilerplate or a cookie cutter form as to what that would look like.
Yeah, it's definitely complex because a 2019 report from the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services says the actual size is impossible to quantify because Virginia's got no reporting mechanisms. And the only stats we have are from legal cases or prosecutions. And many cases, of course, I'm certain are never reported. So the state police report between 400 to 900 arrests each year, but that's not a good indication of the number of victims. So the Hampton Roads Task Force on Human Trafficking was able to identify 52 victims in 2017, but that's just one region, and it's probably only a fraction of the actual number of victims. And we also know that human trafficking is separated, generally speaking, into sex trafficking, which you referenced a minute ago, and labor trafficking. And do you have an idea of what's more prevalent in Virginia?
I could not give you a good answer as to which of those is more prevalent. This legislation was pretty specific to, it was pretty narrowly tailored. And one of the issues with it as well, and I kind of spoke to this earlier, is, you're citing a lot of the numbers and that's good information, but it's important to remember that some of these nonprofit organizations are helping women who maybe aren't from Virginia, or they were trafficked in another state and then they end up here to receive those services because it's, for whatever reason, it might not be safe for them to return to their, hometown or wherever it might be, or obviously where the crime occurred. So there's some ambiguity there as well.
I know, I'm just curious that I remember the case of Elizabeth Smart, who she was sort of out and about and seen in public, but people didn't realize she was in public and people didn't realize that she was trafficking, and she was afraid for stigma because of the stigma that about whether or not she should speak up and say anything. So there are organizations, as you said, that specialize in this. So what do some of these organizations, you mentioned Letitia's House, I assume there are others, what kind of services do they offer these victims, and what might somebody want to go to one of these organizations for?
So Letitia's House offers wraparound services. It's a residential community. So the women who have usually come through via law enforcement, they receive, housing, they receive food, they receive clothing. There's absolutely no cost to them. It is a faith-based component, so I don't know what all the elements there are as far as those conversations go. But the women are, have resources to education so that they complete their high school or elementary school, middle school, whatever level they arrive at. So they have a mission basically every day. For women who are able to, as time goes on, they're able to re-enter the community and work. I know for Letitia's house, and this was one of the reasons that this came up as far as the in-state college tuition is, some of these women, they're not going to maybe go and, get a 4-year degree necessarily, but they do want to go to community college and maybe learn, a specific skill while they're there. So they're looking more for workforce type of training, if you will. And that's very much a mission of Letitia's house, is making sure that these women are able to be there for as long as they need to be there. And that, at the time when they eventually, sort of leave the program, that they are, have all the resources that they need in order to be successful.
You know what else I like about your bill, Delegate, is that most of the existing laws around human trafficking in Virginia is about, like most laws on crime, punishing offenders, which obviously that's certainly important, but there's not that much out there about helping victims. And your bill is an important step in that direction. But as you mentioned, there's probably not a huge population demanding the need for in-state tuition. So I'm wondering, what are the next steps and what else do you think the General Assembly can do?
Honestly, I would probably continue to partner with Letitia's house and see how this bill affects them and their ability to, be successful, and, see. Certainly I take guidance from them. I mean, I'm not an expert in this area. I'm not affiliated with law enforcement. I tend to, go to these places and say, tell me what your needs are. What is a hindrance to you as an organization in helping provide these services for these women? And I kind of want to go back and touch on something. Sure. You're talking about how to, identify victims or whatnot. We actually, it's interesting because, it's hard to sometimes see a victim that's being trafficked, but a situation that we had in Williamsburg area is a number of years ago, there was a house here. It looks completely innocuous, just a brick rancher on a normal, actually a very well traveled road. And inside of this house, they had basically a group of women, and they were being trafficked. They were not from the area. They were actually being trafficked all up and down, the major interstates on the East Coast. And so they would go from house to house to house, not staying there very long. And there's a reason that they do that. Of course, that's so if and when at some point the enterprise is discovered, it's very difficult to prosecute the crimes that are committed because they're multi-jurisdictional. And so that was one of the first things that happened in this area. And, I live in Williamsburg, right? So people think Williamsburg, it's, nothing bad ever happens there. It's colonial Williamsburg. You don't think of this as being a place where you would see a crime of that nature, but it was happening right underneath of folks' noses here. I mean, it was a brick rancher, and, men would come there and, patronize the establishment, and it was busted here. So of course they rescued all of the women, and prosecuted, the folks who were running the organization. So that's one of the reasons that certainly came to my attention. And that was, I can't remember. I think it was before the establishment of Letitia's house, which is a relatively new organization, but sort of all kind of around the same time.
Yeah, this is the first time I've talked about Hampton Roads and trafficking in the context of human trafficking, but Hampton Roads generally has got a huge problem with black market smuggling generally. So like the firearms, cigarettes, all of those things. And one of the reasons for that is, of course, you've got a large port right there at Hampton Roads. You've got the rail line to move quickly. You've got 64 very close to 95, which takes you all up and down. And so at one point, the stretch of 95 for gun trafficking around Richmond was known, I think it was like the Iron Corridor or something like that. So I'm very familiar with trafficking in Virginia of black market objects, but this is the first I've really talked to anybody about human trafficking, and help me get a scale of the problem a little bit better, Delegate, because it's not one I've ever considered before. So what about Letitia's house and really struck you as to them being an organization worth helping and a cause worth taking up?
I mean, I guess I would just say it seemed an obvious cause. I think human trafficking is not something that most people want to think about, and you certainly don't want to think that it's happening in your area. But of course, we became aware of it here because these ladies were being trafficked not only in the Hampton Roads region, but out of the area as well. They're not necessarily, as I said earlier, people who are from Virginia. They're from out of state, and that's why they're here. So they don't have any connections to the community, and there's not a risk for their trafficker to have those folks discovered and they're cut off from their families and all of that. I think it's I think it's important that we make folks aware that this is an actual problem. It can be happening right underneath of your noses. And, in the event that, something is discovered, that there's actually resources for these women. And yes, you mentioned earlier, it can be very complicated because sometimes some of these ladies may have committed a crime along the way. And a lot of that has to do with, and a little bit off topic here, but in that case, sometimes it has to do with, the person who's trafficking them, makes them do these things under, levying threats and things like that. So there's a lot of nuances and challenges in dealing with the issue. I think that anything that we can do that provides resources for these women so that in the event that, either they're apprehended by law enforcement or maybe they are able to just break away individually, although that's very difficult, that, we're doing everything we can to make sure that they're able to move away from that life, because it's very challenging. I mean, a lot of them have addictions. We haven't really talked about that, but of course that's a problem as well. So the medical resources that are required to care for these ladies can be pretty intense. A lot of this goes without saying, but psychological trauma. A lot of these women actually have children. So Letitia's House also works with a lot of legal organizations to help where they can to reunite women with their children if it's at all possible. So there are so many issues that are wrapped into sort of this conversation about human trafficking. But at the end of the day, it's important to remember that these are women who have been, traumatized, they've been victimized. And, if they have moved away from that part of their life, they still have a lot of challenges ahead of them. And it requires careful thought and in some cases legislation. And of course, these nonprofit organizations to help them and have a support network for them.
Delegate, you mentioned all of the circumstances being very diverse, because I think the big fear for human trafficking or about getting trafficked is, a taken situation where you're kidnapped off the street, thrown into a car or a van or whatever, but it doesn't always come out of the blue like that, right? So what are some of these situations? You mentioned drugs or crimes. What are the situations in which somebody could find themselves vulnerable to becoming trafficked?
One of the issues that was raised to me by the administrator of Letitia's House is a lot of times it's women's boyfriends. So they start dating someone, and for whatever reason, I certainly wouldn't be privy to what those internal conversations were, but the boyfriend ends up being their trafficker, and sadly that's a lot of how it happens. And so it sort of is a situation where, the female wants to please their love interest or who they think is their love interest. And that person's really out there to abuse them and exploit them. And sadly, that's how some women get roped into the human trafficking situation. And there may be drugs involved there, anything that the male, typically a male, can do to, keep the woman sort of, to make her reliant on him. They'll do that. And it's just it's a tragic situation, because then you also have the added trauma for these women of there's someone that they thought cared about them, someone that they thought loved them. And, a lot of these women come from very difficult backgrounds. They've already maybe been abused in their home or somewhere in their life. And so they have some vulnerability there. But again, it's an extra layer of trauma for this person that you think cares about you. And actually they are just looking to exploit you. So have heard that scenario many times.
So, Delegate, what would you say the takeaway is for those of us who probably don't think about human trafficking all the time, and maybe we don't know what to think about human trafficking other than that it's a bad thing? What's our takeaway on our way out here?
I would just encourage everyone to, we all have the internet, to go online and do a little bit of research, especially specific to your area. I think a lot of folks think it's not happening around them or it's never happened there, and you might be surprised to learn what's going on right in your backyard. And once you've raised that awareness, look around for what are the organizations that serve these women. I think the work that they do is incredible. It's so challenging. I've heard stories as well of, women who have entered some of these facilities and these organizations, and it's just incredibly difficult for them to recover from the trauma that they've experienced. But I think just letting folks know that this is actually a problem, but there are people who care and are working very hard to ensure that the problem is tackled.
Well, thank you, Delegate, and thank you for joining us.
Pod Virginia is a production of Jackleg Media. Our producer is Arian Ballou, our social media manager is Emily Cottrell, and our advertising sales manager is David O'Connell.
Find us on Facebook or Twitter, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and hey, write a review on Apple Podcast. It really helps people find the show.
We'll be back next week with another episode of Pod Virginia.